Montana Territory, November 1883. A strange structure stood at the edge of Bitter Creek Valley, a cabin that looked like it had been swallowed by a barn. The roof line stretched too far. The walls seemed doubled. Travelers passing through would stop and stare, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Inside that peculiar building, a fire burned steady and hot. Outside, across the valley, neighbors were cursing at smoking, sputtering fires that refused to catch. The woman who built it had been called foolish, wasteful, stubborn. But that winter, while others burned through their woodpiles in half the time, her stack barely shrank. What did she understand about moisture and heat that the experienced homesteaders missed? Today, you're going to see the numbers that silenced an entire settlement. But first, I need you to do something. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because every week, I bring you a survival technique that actually worked when lives depended on it. And this one's going to change how you think about firewood forever. Let's go back to where it started. Her name was Millicent Ashford, though most folks just called her Millie. She'd come to Montana Territory in 1881 with her husband. By the spring of 1883, she was alone, widowed by a logging accident that left her with a half-finished cabin, 40 acres of timber, and a winter to survive. Millie wasn't a builder. She wasn't an engineer. She was a schoolteacher from Ohio who'd learned to swing an axe out of necessity. That first autumn as a widow, she faced a problem that was slowly eating away at her survival. Her firewood kept getting wet. Montana's autumn wasn't just cold. It was wet. Rain came in sheets that lasted for days. Snow would fall, melt, fall again. Her firewood, stacked against the north wall of her cabin like everyone else did it, would soak through. Even the wood she'd split and stacked in August was drawing moisture from the ground, from the air, from the endless gray sky. Wetwood doesn't burn. Or rather, it burns the way desperation feels, slow, smoky, weak. It takes twice as much to generate half the heat. It spits and hisses. It fills your cabin with smoke that burns your eyes and coats everything in a sticky, bitter film. Millie found herself using 3 times the kindling she should need, burning through matches, wasting precious kerosene just to get a fire started. And even then, the fire would struggle, sulking in the firebox, barely radiating enough heat to keep the cabin above freezing. She watched her woodpile shrink at an alarming rate. By her calculations, she'd run out by February, maybe sooner. One night in late October, sitting by a fire that was more smoke than flame, Millie had a thought that seemed backward, almost stupid. What if she built a roof over her firewood? Not just a lean-to, not just a tarp, a real structure, a barn shell built around the entire cabin, creating a protected space where it could stay dry no matter what the weather did. It sounded insane even to her. Who builds a barn over a house? Who adds a second roof, a second set of walls, when winter's already coming? But Millie did the math. She had lumber. She had time, barely. And she had no choice. Running out of firewood meant death. Slow, cold, certain death. So in early November, as the first hard freezes arrived, Millie Ashford began building a barn around her cabin. She extended the roofline 12 feet past the cabin walls on all sides. She framed in rough vertical posts, 8 feet from the cabin walls, creating a corridor all the way around. She left the south side partially open for access, but closed in the north and west walls against the prevailing wind. She shingled the extended roof with split cedar, overlapping tight. What emerged looked bizarre. A cabin inside a barn. A house wearing a coat. The space between the cabin walls and the outer barn walls became her woodshed. Stacked 4 feet high all the way around, protected from rain and snow, ventilated by gaps she'd left deliberately near the roofline. The system was simple, almost crude, but it had one feature she counted on: heat. Her cabin's chimney rose straight through the center of that barn space. Every hour her fire burned, hot air rose from the chimney and spread under the barn roof, creating a warm, dry envelope around her entire wood supply. Convection, thermal circulation. She didn't know those words, but she understood the reality. Warm air rises, and it doesn't disappear. It spreads. It dries. The wood closest to the cabin would dry first. As she used it, She'd rotate wood from the outer edges inward. By the time a log reached the cabin wall, it would be seasoned better than anything her neighbors had. It was improvisation born from panic, a solution that looked like a mistake. And when her neighbors saw it, that's exactly what they thought it was. To understand why Millie's system worked, you have to understand what most homesteaders were doing wrong. Standard practice in Montana Territory was to stack firewood against the outside of your cabin walls. It made sense in a way. Keep the wood close, keep it accessible. Some folks built simple lean-tos, angled roofs that shed rain away from the stack. But here's the problem. Moisture doesn't just come from above. Ground moisture wicks upward through stacked wood. Morning dew condenses on cold logs. Snow melts during the day, seeps between the splits, then refreezes at night, expanding and cracking the wood, creating more places for water to hide. Even under a lean-to, wood exposed to cold air will draw ambient moisture like a sponge. A wet log can contain 40% to 50% water by weight. When you throw in a fire, that water has to boil off before the wood can burn. You're not heating your cabin, you're boiling water. Wasting energy. Wasting wood. Dry, seasoned wood burns at temperatures between 800 and 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Wet wood struggles to break 500 degrees. That difference isn't just numbers. It's the difference between a cabin at 65 degrees and a cabin at 45 degrees. It's the difference between one log lasting 2 hours or needing 3 logs to get 1 hour of heat. Millie's barn-over-cabin system solved this in 3 ways. First, complete overhead protection. Rain and snow never touched her wood supply. The extended barn roof, sloped and shingled, shed precipitation 20 feet away from her stacks in every direction. Second, ground isolation. She'd stacked her wood on rough-cut planks laid across stones, creating an air gap between the ground and the bottom layer. Cold, damp earth couldn't wick moisture upward. Third, and this was the part nobody anticipated, passive kiln drying. Her cabin's stone chimney, built from river rock and clay mortar, rose 18 feet through the center of the barn space. When her fire burned, that chimney radiated heat. Not intense heat, but constant warmth, enough to raise the temperature inside the barn enclosure by 15 to 20 degrees compared to the outside air. Warm air holds more moisture than cold air. As the air inside the barn space warmed, it pulled moisture from the stacked wood. That moisture-laden air rose naturally toward the ventilation gaps near the roof line and escaped. Fresh, drier air was drawn in from the gaps near ground level. Continuous, passive convection, a drying cycle that ran 24 hours a day. Every day, the fire burned. The wood closest to the cabin walls, within 3 feet of the chimney, was essentially being kiln-dried. By the time Millie pulled a log from that stack to feed her fire, its moisture content had dropped to 15%, sometimes as low as 12%. Professional kiln-dried firewood today is considered premium at 20% moisture. Millie was achieving better results by accident, using nothing but geometry, a chimney, and an oversized roof. The system had another hidden advantage: thermal mass storage. 400 linear feet of stacked firewood surrounding her cabin acted as insulation. Those stacks absorbed radiant heat from the cabin walls during the day and released it slowly at night, buffering temperature swings. Her cabin stayed warmer longer after the fire died down. In engineering terms, she created a hygrothermal buffer zone with integrated passive solar kiln dynamics. In practical terms, she made sure her firewood was always dry, always ready to burn hot, and she'd accidentally insulated her entire cabin in the process. But when her neighbors looked at it, all they saw was a woman who'd done things backward. Millicent Ashford's barn cabin became a joke before it even had walls. The first criticism came from Owen Dietrich, a carpenter who'd built half the structures in Bitter Creek Valley. He stopped by in mid-November, watched Millie framing the outer posts, and shook his head. "You're building a barn," he said. "I'm building a woodshed," Millie corrected. "Around your house." "That's right." Owen laughed. Not mean, just bewildered. "Ma'am, that's backwards. You stack wood against the house to block wind. You don't wrap the house in a shed. That's just extra lumber you'll never get back." Millie kept nailing. Wood needs to stay dry. Then build a tarp lean-to like everyone else. This, he gestured at the half-built frame. This is a waste. Word spread. By late November, when Millie was finishing the extended roof, people were riding out just to see it. Not to admire it, to confirm the absurdity. A freighter passing through called it the inside-out homestead. 2 trappers stopped by and asked, in all seriousness, if she was planning to keep livestock inside with her. But the worst came from August Van Dorn, a man who'd survived 16 Montana winters and considered himself an authority on frontier survival. He showed up in early December with 2 neighbors in tow, looked at the finished structure, and delivered his verdict loud enough for everyone to hear. That's the dumbest thing I've seen in 20 years of homesteading. Millie was stacking wood in the southern corridor. She didn't stop. Why's that? You built a rot box, Van Dorn said. All that wood trapped in there with no airflow? It's gonna mold, gonna get punky. And when spring comes and everything thaws, you're gonna have a soppy mess that won't burn worth a damn. I left ventilation gaps. Not enough. Trust me, I've seen this tried. Different setup, same mistake. Wood needs wind to season. You've choked it off. One of the neighbors chimed in, and the weight. You're stacking, what, 3 cord around that cabin? The moisture's gonna settle low, rot your sill logs. Whole thing will sag by spring. Millie didn't argue. She'd learned that arguments didn't solve problems, solutions did. But the judgment stung, especially the muttered comments as the men rode off. Poor woman doesn't know what she's doing. She'd be better off in town. Too stubborn to ask for help. The social dimension was harder than the physical labor. Montana Territory had plenty of independent women, widows, spinsters, women who ran ranches and freight lines and trading posts. But there was still a formula you were supposed to follow. You were supposed to ask for help. You were supposed to defer to the men who'd done it before. Building something strange, something that looked wrong, marked you as difficult, reckless, unwomanly. Some neighbors stopped visiting. Others came by with unsolicited advice that was really criticism wrapped in concern. The phrase that hurt most came from a woman, Sarah Callahan, whose husband had offered to buy Millie's land in the spring when she gave up. Sarah looked at the barn cabin and said, loud enough for others to hear, "That's not a home. That's a woman pretending she doesn't need anyone." Millie kept working, kept stacking wood, kept feeding her fire. By mid-December, the barn enclosure was finished. The wood was stacked. The system was running. And then winter arrived in earnest. December 20th, 1883. The temperature in Bitter Creek Valley dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. It stayed there for 6 days. Then it dropped further. On December 28th, the thermometer outside August Van Dorn's cabin read -4 degrees. By New Year's Day, it was -12. A high-pressure system had settled over Montana Territory like a frozen hand, squeezing out every trace of warmth. But the cold wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the wet. Before the deep freeze, a warm front had pushed through, bringing 3 days of freezing rain. Ice coated everything. Roofs sagged under the weight. Tree branches snapped. And firewood, all that carefully stacked firewood that homesteaders relied on, became encased in a shell of ice. The freeze that followed locked that moisture in place. Across Bitter Creek Valley, people were struggling. Fires wouldn't start. Wood hissed and steamed in fireboxes. Families burned through their supplies twice as fast, using wet wood that barely generated heat. Some folks were mixing in furniture, fence posts, anything dry they could find. Owen Dietrich, the carpenter who'd criticized Millie's design, was going through a cord of wood every 4 days. Normally, he'd use a cord every 2 weeks. His cabin was cold enough that water left in a bucket overnight would freeze solid. August Van Dorn, the man who'd called Millie's system the dumbest thing he'd seen, was burning 3 logs to achieve what 1 dry log should do. His family wore coats indoors. At night, they piled every blanket they owned on the beds and still woke shivering. Sarah Callahan's husband made 2 emergency trips to a lumber camp 15 miles away, trading cash they couldn't afford for dry wood the camp kept under a roof. But Millie Ashford's fire burned steady. Every morning, she walked into the corridor between her cabin and the barn walls. The air in there was cool, but not freezing, usually 20 degrees warmer than the outside temperature. She'd select logs from the stack nearest the cabin, wood that had been drying in the rising heat from her chimney for weeks. The wood was light, bone-dry. When she knocked two pieces together, they rang like a drumbeat. She'd carry 4 logs inside, for logs that would burn hot and clean for 6 hours. Her neighbors were burning 12 logs in the same time and getting half the warmth. By mid-January, people started noticing. It wasn't just that Millie's chimney was smoking. Everyone's chimney was smoking. It was the color of the smoke. Hers was thin and pale, almost invisible. The smoke from Van Dorn's chimney, from Dietrich's, from the Callahans, was thick and dark, the telltale sign of incomplete combustion. Wet wood burning dirty. Then people noticed her woodpile, or rather, how little it had shrunk. Owen Dietrich rode past Millie's place in late January and stopped, staring. He'd helped her move some of that wood in November. He knew how much she'd stacked. By his calculation, she should have been halfway through her supply by now. She wasn't. She'd barely made a dent. Stay with me here, because what happened next silenced every critic in the valley. The numbers were about to become undeniable. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because the measurements I'm about to show you changed everything. February 1884. A thaw arrived, brief and merciful. The temperature climbed to 28 degrees, and people emerged from their cabins to assess the damage winter had done. That's when August Van Dorn decided to settle something that had been bothering him for weeks. He walked to Millie Ashford's place with a proposition. He wanted to measure. He wanted to know, with numbers, whether her system actually worked or if it was just luck, just coincidence, just a woman burning through hidden reserves nobody knew about. Millie agreed. She had nothing to hide. Van Dorn brought 2 other men with him, Owen Dietrich and a freighter named Jacob Carnes who'd wintered in the valley. They weren't coming to mock anymore. They were coming to understand. The first measurement was temperature. Van Dorn had a mercury thermometer he used for weather tracking. Inside his own cabin that morning, with a fire that had been burning for 3 hours, the temperature was 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Millie's cabin, under the same conditions, 3 hours after lighting her morning fire, the temperature was 73 degrees. 14 degrees warmer. Same outside temperature. Same time of day. But that wasn't the shocking part. Van Dorn asked Millie when she'd last fed the fire. She checked the coals and said about 90 minutes ago, she'd added 2 logs at dawn. 2 logs. 90 minutes of sustained heat at 73 degrees. Van Dorn had burned 6 logs in the same time frame to maintain 59 degrees. The math was brutal. Millie was achieving 24% more heat using 67% less wood. Next, they measured wood consumption. Van Dorn estimated he'd burned through roughly 2 1/4 cords since mid-December, about 11 weeks. That's 15 to 16 logs per day, depending on the size of the splits. Millie walked them to her wood corridor. They counted what remained, estimated what she'd started with based on the stack height and density. She'd burned approximately 1 cord, maybe slightly more. 1 cord in 11 weeks. Van Dorn had burned more than double that. Owen Dietrich did his own calculation. He'd used nearly 2 cords in the same period. He stood there in Millie's barn corridor, surrounded by wood that was dry to the touch, light as balsa, and he said something he rarely said. I was wrong. But the most dramatic proof came from the wood itself. Jacob Carnes, the freighter, pulled a random log from Millie's stack and one from Van Dorn's outdoor pile. He brought them inside Millie's cabin and placed them on the hearth side by side. Van Dorn's log was heavy, almost 20 pounds, dark at the ends where moisture had settled. When Carnes knocked it against the stone hearth, it made a dull thud. Millie's log, similar size, weighed maybe 13 pounds, pale at the cut ends. When Carnes knocked it against the stone, it rang sharp and clear like a mallet on dry oak. They split both logs with a hand axe. Van Dorn split wet, literally wet. Moisture glistened on the fresh surface. The wood smelled sour, like decay starting. Millie split clean and dry. The surface was smooth, almost powdery. It smelled like cedar in summer. Carnes threw both pieces into Millie's fire. Van Dorn's piece hissed. Steam rose from it in visible clouds. The flames curled away from it, reluctant. After 5 minutes, it was smoldering, barely burning, producing thick gray smoke. Millie's piece caught immediately. Flames wrapped around it, eager and hot. Within 2 minutes, it was fully involved, burning with a clear, intense heat that you could feel from 6 feet away. No hiss, no steam, no smoke. The three men stood there watching, and nobody said anything for a long time. Finally, Van Dorn spoke. "How long does it take for the wood to dry like that?" Millie thought about it. "If I stack it near the cabin wall, where the chimney heat reaches, 3 weeks, maybe 4. Wood on the outer edges takes longer, maybe 2 months. But I rotate it inward as I use what's dried. And it never molds. Haven't seen any. Air moves through. Warmth keeps it dry enough that rot doesn't start." Owen Dietrich walked the perimeter of the barn corridor, studying the ventilation gaps near the roof, the spacing of the stacks, the airflow patterns. He was a builder. He understood structure. And he was seeing, for the first time, that Millie hadn't built a barn over a cabin. She'd built a kiln, a drying system, a thermal battery. She'd solved the problem everyone else had just accepted as inevitable. Van Dorn did one final measurement before he left. He asked Millie how much would she estimated she'd need to make it through the rest of winter, February and March, another 8 weeks minimum. She walked him through her calculations. At her current burn rate, maybe half a cord. 3/4 at most if the cold came back hard. Van Dorn's face went slack. He was going to need at least another full cord, maybe more. He'd have to buy it, trade for it, or start burning greenwood and suffer the consequences. He looked at Millie, this woman he'd called foolish, stubborn, reckless. This schoolteacher from Ohio who'd survived a Montana winter better than men who'd been doing it for decades. "I owe you an apology," he said. Millie shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. But maybe next autumn you build something like this." Van Dorn nodded slowly. "Maybe I will." By the time he rode back to his own cold cabin, he'd already started planning. Spring came to Bitter Creek Valley in late March 1884. The snow melted, the ground thawed, and homesteaders began the annual ritual of assessing what winter had taken and what they'd need to rebuild. Millie Ashford's barn cabin stood exactly as it had in November, solid and strange. But now, people weren't laughing. They were measuring. August Van Dorn was the first to adapt. In April, he started extending his own cabin's roofline, framing in posts 10 feet out from the north and west walls. He didn't build a full enclosure like Millie had. Money was tight after a brutal winter. But he created a 3-sided woodshed with a roof that captured rising heat from his chimney. By October, when the first cold snaps hit, his wood was drier than it had ever been. Owen Dietrich, the carpenter, built something more ambitious. He convinced 2 neighbors to pool resources and constructed a shared barn structure that covered parts of 3 adjacent cabins. The design was more efficient than Millie's. He'd learned from watching hers, with better ventilation placement and a steeper roof pitch for snow shed. But the core concept was identical. Keep wood dry. Use waste heat. Let convection do the work. Jacob Carnes, the freighter, spread the story. He traveled the territory for work, and everywhere he went that spring and summer, he told people about the widow who'd wrapped her cabin in a barn and cut her wood consumption in half. Some folks believed him. Some didn't. But enough did that, by autumn of 1884, strange structures started appearing across western Montana. Not all of them were barns over cabins. People adapted the concept to their situations, their budgets, their landscapes. A trapper near Grasshopper Creek built a woodshed with a metal chimney pipe running through it, venting his cabin stove exhaust through the wood supply before it exited the roof. A family in Silver Bow built their cabin inside an existing barn, reversing Millie's design but achieving the same result. A Norwegian immigrant named Christoph Bjornstad designed a rotating wood rack system mounted on his cabin's outer wall, where each week he'd move dried wood inward and fresh-cut wood to the outer edge, creating a continuous seasoning cycle. The idea was spreading, mutating, improving. By the winter of 1885 to 86, estimates suggest at least 40 homesteads in western Montana Territory had incorporated some version of Millie's thermal wood drying system. Some worked better than others. Some failed due to poor ventilation or bad placement. But the ones built right The ones that understood the principle of convection, drainage, and air circulation. Those worked beautifully. They all saved wood. They all produced warmer cabins. They all made winter more survivable. In 1887, a territorial surveyor named Wallace Cummings documented vernacular heating innovations across Montana. His report included a section on integrated wood-drying structures, and he specifically cited the Ashford method as the originating design. Millie never sought credit. She never marketed her idea or claimed invention. She'd simply solved the problem the only way she knew how, practically, stubbornly, without waiting for permission. But her neighbors remembered. When Millie eventually sold her homestead in 1891 and moved to Butte to teach school again, the new owner kept the barn cabin exactly as she'd built it. It stood until 1923, when it was finally torn down to make room for a modern frame house. By then, the lesson had outlived the structure. Here's what Millie Ashford understood that her critics missed. Survival isn't about doing things the way they've always been done. It's about observing, adapting, and having the courage to look foolish until you're proven right. She saw wet wood as a solvable problem, not an inevitable hardship. She saw waste heat as a resource, not an afterthought. She saw her cabin as a system, not just a shelter. And she was willing to build something strange because strange was better than cold. The barn over the cabin wasn't genius. It was necessity wearing the disguise of innovation. Sometimes that's all genius is. We live in an age where we've forgotten more survival wisdom than we've retained. We mock old methods as primitive, outdated, inefficient. But the people who lived on the edge of survival, who faced winter with nothing but what they could build, burn, or grow, they understood things we've let slip away. Millicent Ashford didn't have a degree in thermodynamics. She didn't have access to engineering textbooks or university research. She had cold nights, wet wood, and a brain that refused to accept that's just how it is. So she built backward. She built strange. She built something that worked. And when the numbers proved her right, the critics became students. That's the pattern, isn't it? In every generation, in every field, the person who solves the problem differently gets called foolish. Until winter comes. Until the test arrives. Until the measurements speak louder than mockery. Then the strange becomes standard. The mistake becomes method. The fool becomes the teacher. Millie's story isn't about cabins or firewood. It's about what happens when you trust your observations more than traditions. When you're willing to look ridiculous in November so you can stay warm in January. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? What's the coldest winter you've ever faced? And would you build something like this if you had to survive off-grid? Hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. Because next week, I'm bringing you another frontier hack that saved lives when everything else failed. Stay warm. Stay curious. And remember, the best solutions sometimes look like mistakes until you measure them. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.